Good afternoon, everyone, or maybe morning or evening, depending on your time zone. And welcome to today's panel, which is called Varieties of Decarbonization Conversations. It's organized by the Working Group on Decarbonization, which again is part of the Task Force of Climate Governance. My name is Melina Niesen. I've sort of helped this working group in its early days with outreach and membership. And I'm delighted that I was asked to moderate today's discussion, where I will explore the role of narratives and imaginaries in shaping decarbonization pathways across a variety of sectors. And sort of the topic climate change mitigation involves much more than just policy interventions, as we all know. It's also shaped by the stories that we tell and the futures that we imagine. And yeah, today's fascinating presentations will all touch in some shape or form on how these narratives influence the decisions that are made by key actors and how they impact socio-institutional structures. So I'm excited to hear about everyone's research, which is often an ongoing process. So we'll really see how this research is also being made. Let me briefly explain how the panel will be structured. So each presenter will have 10 minutes, which is also important that you hopefully keep the time because it's a tight schedule. 10 minutes to deliver their presentation, then followed by a 5-minute discussion with a designated discussant. And then we'll open the floor for audience questions. And here we'd really ask you to use the Q&A function of the Zoom interface so everyone can see your questions. And at the end, if we still have time, we'll also hold an open floor discussion for any remaining thoughts or questions. So if you don't get to ask them the first time round, don't worry, we'll hopefully have time at the end. Let's dive in. Our first presentation will be given by Ksenia Anisimova and Ratnapriya Baisani. Yes, I think it's titled Exploring Decarbonization Through Institutional Narratives, Evidence from Germany, Mexico, and India. And this is sort of an in-house paper that is being worked on by this working group, as many of you will know. And their research examines how institutional narratives shape decarbonization efforts in these 3 countries, focusing on renewable energy transitions and the challenges faced in each context. I hope that was somehow correct. So yeah, Ksenia and Ratna, you can jump in and share your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. Milena, thank you so much for opening this panel. And while I'm trying to share my screen, I would like to say that me and Ratna today are very excited, not only to present, but also to represent. Hopefully you see the presentation right now. Can you see it? I just cannot see you.
We can see it. Yeah, fine. We
Perfect.
can see it.
Excellent. So we would like to represent an excellent team. As you said, Milena, it's very sort of in-house work done together with Valeria, Chris, Miranda, Kai, and Aviram, who are also in the audience today. So, and as you said, indeed, we're trying to explore the decarbonization for institutional narratives. And the idea about this paper came about a year ago, exactly at the ESG for a conference in Nijmegen last year. We got together and we started thinking, sort of a brainstorm session. Okay, what actually decarbonization is, what this complex phenomenon is all about. And we started sketching and we realized there's so many ideas, so many things around decarbonization. And we thought, okay, this is also a research problem in itself. How we could sort of unpack the plurality of meanings, dimensions, and perspectives. So the first thing that came to mind when we were talking about decarbonization, and literature confirms so, that basically decarbonization could be defined as a reduction of CO2 emissions from economic activities. This is the most generic definition. But then, of course, different perspectives follow. For example, decarbonization could be perceived as a technological transition or a set of thereof, trying to also see different analytical cuts, how technology changing in order to facilitate this reduction of CO2 emissions. At the same time, the economic and industrial transformation and the entire subset of literature also tries to develop the train of thought regarding decarbonization within this field, including social institutional shifts that sometimes it's still debated, it's chicken and egg problem, what precedes actual process of decarbonization? Shall we first adjust the institutions and then start, or it sort of would follow organically? Similar policy and regulatory reforms same set of problems, including wider ideological paradigms like degrowth, post-growth perspective, and how decarbonization could potentially fit, or whether it would something that lead to this type of paradigms. So as you could see, it's very sort of complex topic, and that is why we thought if we add a layer of complexity represented by different actors, different stakeholders involved in the decarbonization, this really gives a very much complex puzzle that we would like to unpack. And to begin with, so the entry point here, we embarked on the institutional narratives about decarbonization. And therefore, the research question we posed is quite broad, and then we consequently zoomed on some particular cases. What institutional narratives about decarbonization exist in different world regions? And why we actually decided to start with institutional narratives is that we observed that mostly at this point, decarbonization occurs at the top-down level, meaning usually the state is the one that starts this process through policy changes, etc. Of course, starting from international layer, but we would focus only on the national one. And we also would like to understand how the state-driven narratives refine our understanding of phenomenon of decarbonization and also the policy making around it, actual part of the implementation of decarbonization. And therefore, we aspire to make three types of contributions. The first one, we really would like to understand better this complex phenomena, especially using a narrative lens at the institutional or state level, more specifically. At the same time, we would like to bring a comparative lens here and to conduct a comparative analysis across three countries, sort of chosen to be proxies for different regions. So therefore, it would allow us to gather insights across different contexts. And cumulatively, hopefully, this would help to identify opportunities for policy learning and identification of synergies, perhaps also brought to the international level. So feeding back to the international here. And in a nutshell, methodological approach is sort of, I would like to split on data scoping and method here. So as I mentioned, we focus exclusively on the state level narratives, meaning we focus for now key official policy documents. Most of these documents are actually strategies and overarching policy documents. And we're trying to zoom in on renewable energy policies. Again, from a quick skim of literature, we realize that for now, the conversations around decarbonization that happens across several regions are mostly about renewable energy, and wind and solar are the conventional sources. And the cases we've chosen are Germany, Mexico, and India. Basically, these countries, these are the largest emitters in the respective regions. So in Latin America, or in Latin America for Mexico, in the EU for Germany, and in India for Southeast Asia. And time frame, we sort of decided to do like Paris Agreement up until now, so including 2023. And this was the method we selected, a sort of reflective, abductive approach. And at the very core of it lies thematic analysis with five core themes. The first one is rationales. So we're trying to understand what is the main motivation of those countries or the states to introduce the conversation about decarbonization. Then we also, through scanning the documents, we try to understand what are the key enablers, how they are mentioned, what are these facilitating elements that are currently part of the either institutional or economic structure, or also infrastructure, for example, what's there already, what are the elements there that could help facilitate decarbonization? Who are the main agents? Who are the stakeholders? Whether the government takes the lead or also tries to diversify and, for example, appeal to private sector to help out or even give some directives. At the same time, also, we wanted to zoom in on the challenges or the bottlenecks in the problems, because very often in the policy text, we identified potential risks or problems to tackle in order to facilitate decarbonization. And also the final theme, which is sort of an open-ended one and more forward-looking, it's about opportunities. What are the opportunities certain decarbonization processes present for the country, and perhaps they could be integrated in a broader development strategies. And to illustrate this sort of methodological approach, we would like to give a few empirical examples. I would like to first discuss the case of Mexico, and then Ratna proceeds with the case of Germany and India. So the first one, the case of Mexico. I would like to say that since 2015, also in the light of energy reform, Mexico has been making advanced steps in making sort of decarbonization a reality. And the key rationale, surprisingly, for Mexico was the climate change commitments. So not even energy security comes second, but really these proclamations around the importance of climate change and the fact that actually Mexico is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change make it essential for Mexico to transition to the decarbonization pathway. As for the enablers, legislative and policy frameworks are named one of the most frequent enablers. Also, the presence of natural resources, foreign investment, and private sector initiatives were listed as the most common enablers. Actors, not only state, but also private sector and remarkably international financial institutions are quite active in driving decarbonization forward. Inter-American Development Bank, for example, and other international organizations really facilitate decarbonization in Mexico. One of the challenges which we observed through reading policy documents is sort of policy uncertainty, especially because of the change of the government and the wider agenda of the government down the road. Also, financial constraints, infrastructure gap, and social and land use conflicts, including the fossil fuel power or hegemony of the existing structures, are still there. As for the opportunities, this is very interesting because for Mexico, decarbonization could unlock economic regional development to make sure that regions keep on developing more or less on equitable manner, and also to increase international competitiveness and to facilitate sustainability orientation and even launch new developmental paradigm. So in case of Mexico, we see that this is sort of widely integrated in the broader narratives of this development and sustainability orientation. And we also see that multitude of actors are getting involved, and there are certain challenges, but overall, the direction towards decarbonization is very much straightforward. And Radna, you will take it from there, I believe.
Yeah,
Thank you.
next. Can you, yeah. So coming to the Germany, I have to warn you before that, like, the research has not been yet done totally. Like, there are like few more policy documents has to be analyzed. But like the major rationales we have found in the Germany is economic development and also the climate change commitments, and economic development being a very important rationale here because it provides like many job opportunities. And so that's why the government has shown like a lot of interest. That's what we have realized from the documents. And coming to the enablers, like the geographical conditions of Germany, especially coming to the wind energy, the special economic zones of like the coastal areas has like a lot of wind potential, which could be converted into the energy. So that has been seen as observed as a main enabler over here. And actors coming to the Germany, like mostly it is government driven from the documents what have been analyzed so far. And also the energy providers do play a major role over here, the private players in shaping these policies. And coming to the challenges, like mainly with the bureaucracy has been observed to be the main challenge over here, especially with the approvals of land allocation and also the transmission channels. So that has been the biggest challenge over here. And also infrastructural challenges, specifically the grid connectivity, and also and in addition to that, there has been a lot of cross-sectoral competition which has been observed, especially with the agricultural sector and also marine life, because to establish these wind farms or like the solar farms, like it was required to the land availability also is very less. So it has been constant tussle that has been found. And impending Ukraine war and all these wars, like the import cost has been increased a lot, and that is also like rising the cost of this renewable energy transition within the country. And again, environmental protection comes with the societal backlash also. So these were the main challenges has been identified, but these are not the limited, I would presume, because more research has to be done in this case. Next one, please. And coming to India, like from 2015, like India's major policy backing is the National Solar Mission, which has been started in 2010. And most of the policies from 2015 were like to support that National Solar Mission has been developed. So, and as Paris Agreement was signed, the narratives have changed. Initially, the renewable energy was more seen as an economic opportunity, but with time, like it has, the government narrative have changed into the climate change commitments, because it want to reduce the climate impact within the country. So that has been found to be major rationale in the new policies, at least recent policies. And energy security has been always a big dominant factor in promoting the renewable energy policies in India, because it kinds of provide like not only the national security, being self-reliant and not depending on imports, but also for the last mile communities, because till date, like India has like many regions, like the last mile communities do not get electricity. And the one advantage with solar or wind has been identified as the standalone systems. So that has been utilized to reach the underprivileged communities in India. So that has been the major narrative, to give electricity to everyone. And then enablers we have seen is that geographical advantage. Being a tropical country, India has like more major solar potential due to its intensity. So that has been utilized by the government to its advantage to promote renewable energy at a larger scale. And then supportive policies, as I mentioned, the renewable solar mission was one of the biggest supporting factor to promote Indian policies in that direction. And then the business opportunities with solar, like not only the large scale solar and wind business opportunities, but also a lot of innovation at small scale has been seen, like in packets with the government. And then one climate literacy has been like a very passing by narrative. I could say that enabler, I could say that, because people are more interested in utilizing, moving into more renewable energy sector, like that has been observed, but I wouldn't say it's as a dominant enabler for the government to come up with. And coming to actors again here, national and state governments has been the major pushing factors. And then energy providers and also the local social sector people have also like played a major role in pushing these narratives. And coming to the challenges, again, similar to Germany and Mexico, it comes to the infrastructure, bureaucracy, especially with the land allocation in India has been a major challenge. And also like with the fossil fuel dominance has been there, like India is not a country which has accepted to the fossil phase out, like it keeps on using the fossil fuel. So till date, like fossil fuel dominance is existing there. And then with wind, we have seen an peculiar like national security issue, given that India is placed in between many countries. The Indian Ocean has seen as like a very important area for the international waters. So that has been seen as a national security issue to actually place like offshore wind or solar solar parks. And then opportunities, we see like the emerging opportunities are observed to be the climate leadership, especially for the global south. India has emerged as a climate leader, so that's one of the thing. And then obviously economic development and improving the technology, indigenous technology has been seen as a major opportunity India has been utilizing for the past few years. So next, please. So then coming to the common, because we have done a comparative analysis, the common narratives which we have seen is the energy security and climate change mitigation as the major. And I think it's not surprising because the Paris Agreement and also like each and every COP, like we are seeing to bring like all the nations to push this climate mitigation narrative. So these were the common narratives, and also renewable energy especially gives a lot of job opportunities. And this has seen as a common push forward in all three countries. And there are like different, we haven't like really done much dig deeper into, because and also the main thing is that we cannot just see these are the documents we have seen only from the government perspective, right? Like, so we cannot say for sure that these are the reality also in another notion. So, but from the government perspective, we see these two as the major pushing factors. So next slide, like, and then for the coming to the discussion, the three major challenges we are facing as a group, like while doing research, is that are we missing out on any themes or narratives? Because we found that like these themes and narratives to be quite good for now, but we are just expecting like have we missed out on any other themes like that we could focus on? We would really like to know your opinion on that. And for now, like we have just focused on the policy documents, by few of the strategy documents, but not much into them. So we are thinking like, should we expand beyond the policy documents and go into the strategy documents in depth to understand more narratives? And also like to see that like should it be a more interpretative analysis rather than just being a direct analysis like which has been promoted by the government, or should we read between the lines? Like we would like to hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Xenia and Ratna. That was a really insightful presentation. Yeah, now we'll move into a brief discussion. We have to be a little bit cautious of the time. So I'd like to now involve our discussant, Coralie Boulard, who is a PhD researcher at KU Leuven, and she specializes in political cleavages and the linkages of social, economic, and ecological issues in France, which is, I think, also really interesting here since we have another country that we have expertise on this floor. Coralie, maybe first, like, do you have any pressing feedback that you would like to give to Xenia and Ratna's presentation? Maybe also considering that they ask for specific feedback at the end of their presentation.
Okay, I mean, I have a few comments, but hello everyone already. I want to thank you for inviting me to discuss your work. I'm happy to see some familiar faces, and thank you for the presentation. I also just want to start by giving, a little nod or raising a glass to kind of your collaboration. I think it's really cool that you've created this working group and that you're working on a paper together. Also, because you're like a diverse group of people coming from different universities, and I think you're using that as a strength in the paper by looking at different regions of the world. So I think, yeah, big nod to that. I think as a whole, I don't have like essential comments. It seems like you know what you want to do, you have a rather clear way of going about it. It's mostly a matter of kind of like, well, finalizing your analysis, as you mentioned in your email, and now also in kind of, putting everything together so that you kind of make a strong argument and have something that's really like clear and coherent. So all the comments that I have, I hope kind of help you to think about that. And again, I appreciate that it's a draft version. Probably some of the comments are going to be things that you already have in mind, that you've already mentioned, and just are not on paper now. I do find also that the presentation made things come a bit clearer than they were in the paper. Bon, voilà. I'm going to try to not repeat myself too much because I kind of get lost in my notes. But voilà. So I mean, pretty much the what of your research, I think, is very clear. We know what you're doing. You're looking at decarbonization narratives of, the national governments of different countries. And because, narratives gives hint as to like the directions that they're going, and so can allow us to critique them or show where there is progress or none. So that's kind of like your onto-epistemic position, is that we use narratives to construct the world. That's how we understand the world. And so to grasp reality would be to look at discourse and narratives. So voilà. And then the how of your research is that you analyze through climate policy, how that features in climate policy, focusing on 3 countries. and restricting, I guess, to wind and solar part of the climate strategies, probably for feasibility reasons, mostly to kind of restrict your data set. Okay, so this is kind of like the research practice in itself, which I think is pretty clear to me. What's a bit less clear is, or which could be made stronger, because I think it is clear, but I think you could make a bigger contribution, is the why of the research. So kind of like, what does analyzing all of this show you really? What is the purpose of looking at this? Especially because in research, if we're supposed to be, talking to, the rest of the research that exists out there in the world, and add contributions to it, I think it gets a little tricky, because there have been quite, similar research endeavors. There's many articles looking at, the different discourses of sustainable development, of the energy transition, I think is mostly the one that is most similar to yours. But also like climate justice and all that. They look at different actors. They do look at, national governments and, national climate strategies. So kind of like the question kind of becomes, what does your paper do that is very different? And you mentioned a couple of contributions, like looking at the qualitative aspect, national level, but these are things that have been kind of done. So what is the different angle? And I think, and it does come out of your paper, but I think it should be made really stronger, is the comparative aspect. And once you make that stronger, then that means you need tools for comparison also, which would probably guide afterwards your theoretical framework, which would probably be a lot more about, the role of context of different settings in influencing different decarbonization strategies. So I guess it's also kind of like explorative. And so you're just, thinking, okay, we're going to look at, 3 different countries and see kind of what comes up. So I imagine that will come afterwards. But I would suggest maybe instead of kind of raising all the different contributions, we always, make so many, more or less important contributions, but mostly like embedding yourself in existing research more, to say like, we're, part of this research stream and strand that looks at like different narratives around decarbonization, around the energy transition. So we're aligned with this sort of movement, but we want to contribute this different approach, which is, I think, probably the comparative aspect. So that's maybe something, about the research objectives specifically, to kind of make clear. There's also something, I need to make sure of time also. There's another thing that, stood out to me, is the focus on decarbonization, of why decarbonization and not the energy transition, what is exactly specific, what is the difference? Maybe there's something that I don't exactly see, but why would we use that term specifically? Especially because, what's interesting to me is that, for me, decarbonization is a type of discourse already about kind of like, the crisis and the solutions, the crisis that we're facing and the solutions that we're facing, that we're trying to have. So there would be like, different discourses like socio-ecological transformation or green growth, and decarbonization would be part of them. Because also when you're looking kind of like at the etymology of the word, it's kind of, as you said, and when you were kind of defining it, like in the very raw thing is like to remove carbon, so carbon emissions, and ation, which is like the process of removing carbon emissions. And so it's already a very reductionist way, I think, of understanding the crisis that we have. It's not talking about, social relations of production. It's not talking about, capitalism or political economy. It's already kind of, setting the thing quite in limited ways. And of course, that implies, it's multifaceted. That implies lots of things with like institutions, democracy, and all of that. But it seems like it's already a very status quo kind of approach. So what does it mean to look at this? That doesn't mean, you shouldn't be looking at it, but that means there's maybe something interesting to look at in there. It's like, okay, if we focus on those more like mainstream approaches to the climate crisis, what is it? Are there nuances in the way that this is expressed? Is it different from a context to another? And because maybe that can tell us about, maybe some context which can lead to something else more than others. So I don't exactly know where I'm trying to go with this, but a thought that I had with the term decarbonization, of just like, what is it? Why decarbonization and not energy transition? And why decarbonization and not like socio-ecological transformation? So voila. I want to say also that I really like the narrative aspect. I remember reading it at the beginning and thinking, oh, you know, a narrative, it has like actors and like a project and like tools to get to that project. I hope they have that after, and so happy to read afterwards the way that you do your analysis with those different core themes. I think you can mention that directly, like in your abstract or in your introduction, so that it is clear, like we're looking at decarbonization narratives, which includes, you know, what is the objective, the actors involved and the processes. Kind of going maybe to your question about things to include in there, would maybe be also kind of like, what is the problem that they're trying to tackle? Is it, you know, purely carbon emissions, or is it, you know, more a systemic issue? And maybe also looking at like tools. Is it, you know, through regulation? Is it through empowering citizens? Is it market-based instruments? But otherwise, I think it's already quite, yeah, quite full what you have. I have lots of other things I could comment on, but I don't know if I'm already over time. I'm happy to continue, but is it?
Coralie, thank you for this absolutely rich and wonderful feedback. Maybe if we have time, we can get back to what you also have,
Okay.
but maybe Xenia and Ratna could, if they want to, respond quickly to some of your points. Otherwise, I also have questions.
Yeah, Coralie, thank you so much for such rich feedback. And indeed, you touched upon the sort of exactly the Achilles points here. We were thinking about, okay, decarbonization, how it's different from energy transition. That is why we embarked on this critical journey a little bit, trying to explore. It's not necessarily for the sake of the name of the working group, decarbonization, not the sort of introspection and understanding why we're called this way, but it's more about actually what does this notion contribute to the literature and how it is perceived in the literature. So it's very much on point, and we continue to grapple with this. And of course, you're right, the very core of this is comparative aspect of these three cases. But just because it's still the preliminary stage, we are not fully done with the analysis itself. So we were thinking, okay, it's a bit prematurely to bring some, already conclusions and the sort of intuitions we have based on the case knowledge we gathered. So it's definitely something to highlight and make it more pronounced in the paper later on, including the embeddedness in the existing literature without actually standing on the giants already and building from there and going forward. This is the main idea. But thank you so much, very helpful. And we would also be grateful if you could send us your feedback. If you have more points, we could discuss it later with you for the sake of time. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I also want to add, maybe that's something that we can actually keep in mind for the remainder of this session, and also, with the ongoing work of this working group that we look at. If we compare these sectoral analyses, these national analyses, like why do we use this term decarbonization? What is actually, what does make this, and how does it play into the different discourses? How Coralie described it, I thought that was quite fascinating. Maybe we can now move on to the question and answer, if there's nothing that you want to discuss now between each other. So there was one question: how will the research avoid generalizing trends within countries that are pretty large? For example, I would assume different states in India, for example, will have a completely different approach to decarbonization. So I guess that applies to like the sub-national level in a sense. Anything you want to say to that?
Just to go with that, like this was something we have thought about initially, and like we were like more we realized that it would be much more better to focus on the national perspective, because like in India, most of the narrative, like at least the major narrative, is run through the national government. And the states are there, like they are more of implementation, like they do bring like a lot of different changes within their policy frameworks, the implementation frameworks, because based on the reality of the state, right? Like it's very different in different states. But and especially when we are doing a comparative analysis between three different countries, like then if we start bringing in more the subnational narratives into it, and it would become, the situation becomes much more complex. So like that's also one of the reasons like which we have seen. But majorly, like in India, like this case, at least I could say, is that all the narratives are run from the national level. So that also makes it much more important to focus from there. And then it's more like implementation is something we are not like still getting into as of now in that. Yeah. So.
Okay, Sharan, you also have a question?
Yes, and it's really, really interesting research. And I was wondering, maybe you already thought that in your mind, but I didn't notice that in the test that you put in the case selection. So what are the criterias for you? Because basically now you're doing the analysis on the policy documents, right? So what are the criterias of selecting those policy documents? Because I can imagine that if you selecting them based on the objectives that they have for each one of this policy document, they probably already touch upon the narratives of decarbonization or carbon emission, right? Or others criteria maybe like if you notice there's decarbonization actions within the policy document that is mapping for this policy. So I was wondering, is there anything for this criteria that you have in your mind when you do this selection? You have a more systematic way of doing that, or you have a broader term of including all this policy in your data set, and you do the narratives analysis to compare them. So what is the approach? That's what I'm curious about. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question, Sharon. Very much on point when it comes to technicalities of the search we've conducted. So we first embarked on the very structured policy search. So we used keywords to identify the set of documents we could work with. Of course, using the wind and solar energy as the starting point, and then took it from there. Eventually, it resulted in thousands of documents across 3 countries. Especially Germany was the most prolific country, like producing different documents and policies related. And eventually, we sort of decided to go with the strategies, sort of high-level strategies. Of course, the time frame is very much fixed, so it helps. So the starting point was Paris, post-Paris, and then there was very few documents at the very beginning, and we started sort of using this snowball in practice later on. So we identified core documents, initial ones, and of course, eventually it was developing through the network of documents which we tracked down. But again, we would like to stay at the high level, so it's key strategies, key policy documents, which usually several hundreds pages, meaning it's very much rich policy data already. And then we decided to not go further into the sectoral plans or further, detailing documents. So we would stay at the high level policy documents here. Yeah, rather snowballing and really like seeing how it develops organically.
Okay, I suggest that we also now snowball into our next presentation, which is by Jasmine Locke-Scarvel. She's a PhD researcher at Utrecht University. Her research is titled Navigating the Eye of the Storm, Policy Conflict and Bureaucratic Policymaking in Australia and Canada. And it explores how bureaucrats adapt their practices in response to climate policy backlash with a focus on carbon pricing policies in Australia and Canada. I'm going to give you the floor. You have 10 minutes sharp for your presentation, and then we'll move into the discussion.
Great, thank you, Milena, and I'll try and hopefully be pretty quick at the start to get back a bit of time for us. So let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see this, even though I can't see you. There we go. All right. So as introduced, the topic of my presentation today is about bureaucratic actors and their role in conflicted policy making. So I think it's a really nice juxtaposition to looking at different state actors in different settings. So a bit of background. So the project that I'm part of, and which Xenia as well is also a part of, the team, is looking at dynamics and drivers of climate policy backlash. So what we mean by that is everything from yellow vests, these are yellow vests protests in Canada, all the way to Extinction Rebellion protests. But basically it's when reactions quite negative and really transgressively negative to climate change policies. So we think that understanding backlash is really important because it's fundamental to try and figure out how policies can become more durable and how we can get those decarbonisation pathways, right? So within the project, I'm looking at the institutional dimension of backlash, cue institutional narratives. Before this project, I was a bureaucrat in the Australian government, as a lot of you already know, and that is why I am looking at these boring old white men, mostly, bureaucratic actors. So I am arguing throughout my PhD, looking into how bureaucratic actors have a role in backlash situations and how backlash affects them. So I've submitted the paper that I'm presenting today recently, yay, and I also presented some of this at the Nijmegen ESG last year. So I'll try and skip past the earlier parts and focus on what I've updated thanks to your great feedback from some of you and how the paper landed. So the research question I'm focusing on in this paper is looking at how bureaucratic policymaking practices change in response to backlash. Now, by practices, I'm trying to keep a really grounded view, and that's looking specifically at how in everyday work bureaucrats react and deal with backlash. So how did I then operationalize this? Well, this is a big table. Sorry, you don't have to read it all, but basically what myself and my supervisor, James, also looked at was in all of the mostly public administration literature, what practices do bureaucrats use to have political influence? And by political, I mean like changing and shaping policy, not necessarily partisan politics. We looked at quite familiar streams of literature there, so procedural politicking, bureaucratic autonomy, actors and agency, pulled them together and thought about which ones would be most pertinent in situations of very conflicted policy, and then thought about how they might be affected or changed by backlash in both the immediate experience of that backlash and then in the long term. So I don't have time to look at each of these in specifics, but maybe just as an example, say the middle one, procedure steering. So that's based off a lot of the public admin literature that is talking about the advantages that bureaucrats have in owning policy-making processes, right? So they own reviews, they run secretariats, that sort of thing. So in the short-term situation of policy conflict, they might use those strategies and tactics they have to help buffer against the pressures around conflict. And perhaps as that conflict subsides or dissipates, maybe they don't need to use it anymore, or maybe, as we've expected here, they try and even further isolate and keep stability in a policy using these procedure steering tactics. Okay, so empirically, I have two cases, as I mentioned in the title, in Australia and Canada. I focused on carbon pricing specifically, and Australia and Canada as two very similar demographic and economic cases where there was also really strong backlash to carbon pricing policies. So in Australia, there was a progressive Labor government from 2007 onwards. They attempted and failed to bring in a carbon price. Then finally, they brought in one called the carbon pricing mechanism, which was actually an emissions trading scheme. But there was a lot of opposition to this, particularly led by the conservative political opposition. But as you can see in the picture up here, there was a lot of vitriol leveled against it. Even from before it was legislated, a lot of that was quite personal, directed at the female prime minister at the time. And then eventually, by 2013, this amount of backlash had an effect, and the government was ousted through an election. And the incoming Conservative government, their platform was, well, get rid of the carbon tax, which they duly did. And then after that, there was about a decade of complete instability in climate change policy in Australia, with nothing much happening, lots of things proposed and failing. Likewise, in Canada, you had a more progressive government come in. So I'm looking at from when Trudeau came in. He promised to bring in a type of carbon price. the provinces are a really interesting flavour in this case, because it's actually the provincial politics and the politicians that have led backlash against it. So by 2018, there was a greenhouse gas pollution pricing scheme. Now I'm getting the acronym mixed up, but they have a scheme in place there, and it's still in place now. But the backlash against it, for instance, in the province of Ontario, as you can see in the image here, was quite transgressive. So this is a sticker that was mandated to be put on petrol pumps or gas pumps in that state, in that province, saying how much the federal government was going to cost you money. So we basically got two cases, one where the policy was repealed, one where the policy wasn't, but both had really strong backlash. And I did 68 interviews of key policymakers and then coded all of that lovely, lovely data. So findings, which is hopefully where I can spend the most time. So this is a lot of diagrams, so I'll try and take you through it. So the headline, as per usual with qualitative case studies, is that there was a mix of different things against that heuristic that I put up originally. So I can't take you through each one in detail, but some of our expectations were true, some of them not so much. But there are a couple of really interesting trends we found. First of all, in the short term, actually, bureaucrats were less, I would say, less affected by the really strong backlash happening than we thought they might be. And that's kind of a good thing normatively, because it might mean that they actually remain in these two countries quite professional, quite apolitical, as their sort of ideal is supposed to be. Another possibility, though, is that it could be something to do with them being not as reactive to public sentiment as they should be. So I don't know which is which. Maybe they're not as flexible as they should be, and maybe they are more apolitical than we thought. It could be both at the same time. So I thought that was interesting. Then in the longer term, we had this divergence, right? So in Australia, we really saw the interviewees said, oh yeah, we had to really push to adapt. Conflict continued, and we just had to keep trying all these different things in our practices to try and make policy better. Whereas in Canada, they were like, oh yeah, conflict dissipated. There was a Supreme Court ruling in 2021 that said the policy was constitutional. It still exists. We're just doing our everyday politics now. So why was that the case? I think the obvious answer here is that the level of conflict differed in the long term. So in Australia, bureaucrats perceived that the conflict continued. In Canada, not so much. But actually, that doesn't explain a curious thing that my Canadian participants had, which was that bureaucrats in Canada were like, yeah, conflict's fine, it's all over, we're getting on with our everyday jobs. But my non-bureaucrat participants, so interest group members, NGOs, that sort of thing, were a lot more circumspect and said actually they were very worried that backlash was going to come back and it was still around. So I then looked at, well, what are the other drivers here that I think actually affect how bureaucrats perceive conflict rather than how conflict actually eventuates? And that perception is what is affecting if or how they react in that longer term context. So that's where these conditions come in. So I'll go through them pretty quickly, but basically in the more external exogenous context, we have policy stability. So in Australia, as I said, policies were totally destabilized. Many possible things were proposed by bureaucrats and then just flopped by the government. Whereas in Canada, you've got a really stable, relatively stable trajectory. In the middle, you have the focus of the conflict. So in Australia, we saw actually the conflict sort of turned from a public facing, like those protests in terms of backlash, to even internal within government. So even within the incumbent cabinet, ministers were fighting with each other about what they thought the policy goals should be. The whole context and words around a carbon tax were totally taboo. So anything that was anything like that was just pulled off the table immediately. Canada, not so much. In fact, the conflict remained mostly external. And then finally, of course, we're talking about bureaucrats as real individuals working in an organizational context. And I found a lot of my participants were really, really strongly motivated by the goal of the climate policy. And maybe this is just a particular thing with the ideologies and backgrounds of these people, but like a lot of us, I'm sure, they really wanted to have climate policy be more ambitious to put us in a decarbonisation pathway. And I think that background led to them really judging quite strongly a perception of whether their preferences of policy aligned with their governments or not. So in Australia, the more bureaucrats felt that the ideal policy was not where the government was taking them, they pushed harder. They sort of resisted what the government was doing a lot more strongly. So yeah, that's basically the main findings of my paper. So a quick recap. I know I'm running out of time. So climate policy backlash. I hope I've explained to you what that is and convinced you why it's important to discuss bureaucrats in the context of it. And I've taken you through some findings, and particularly some of those interesting dynamics and conditions that affect how those actors react and shape those trajectories. So I wanted to point out two things as a final point. So firstly, I think bureaucratic actors are really interesting, even though they seem to be boring. And I think they're vital to understanding decarbonisation pathways. So a lot of the time their roles are behind the scenes, right? And that should be the case. They're not supposed to be in the public eye, but that's why I'm sort of arguing that they're in the eye of the storm. They're kind of hidden in all this turmoil, trying to make policy trajectories more stable and more ambitious. They're one of many actors, of course. I'm not saying that they're acting alone or that they're always benevolent, but it's important to look at these sorts of actors. My second point is that if they are doing this stuff behind the scenes, they have some potential to be the people who unlock the transformation that we normatively need. So if we're talking about transformations and all of these barriers, as you're talking in the national cases to it, the contestation over climate policy is not going to go away. Who and how can we try and unlock something that's, yeah, more transformative, more ambitious? Maybe these guys are some people to talk to and to maybe influence. Of course, that also means normatively, should unelected officials be doing this? So there's some legitimacy questions about that too, right? Should we be relying on, in a democratic system, on unelected officials to try and push this work? Ideally, probably not, but maybe we kind of have to, if that's the transformation that we need. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I thank you for keeping an eye on the time. I could have listened for hours to this firsthand view into what policymakers are thinking and bureaucrats are thinking about these policies in Australia and Canada. Maybe for a brief discussion, I'll bring in Sharan to the floor. Jasmine, since you've had such great experience with feedback at ESG conferences, maybe you also want to elicit some specific feedback to your ongoing work from Sharan. And then Sharan can hopefully also give some feedback that she had on the top of her mind.
Yes, you can still hear me, right? Yeah, I'm trying to find my Zoom screen. It's disappeared. But yeah, Sharan, thank you for looking at my presentation. I think one of the main things I'm interested in is those conditions and how you think they logically interact and what you think the next steps might be.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jasmine. And I have to admit, I find this paper really fascinating. And also, congratulations that you submit this paper. I can tell a lot of work behind the scene, because I noticed that for the interview is cross 10-year span. So it's a really, really impressive work, and well done. And I'm really looking forward to read your paper once it get published. And in regarding the question you raised, I think I have a lot of things in my mind. I will try to be as organized as possible. I'm not the expert of bureaucratics politics, but I also admit that I think if it involves bureaucratics, politics, and the people that is are be responsible for making policy and implementing policy, there's really like tons of factors can have the conditions, like interact with one another and have the impact on the real outcome. That's also the reason why people doing policy research are super cautious when they try to understand why this will happen, right? So I think that's the main challenges when people are trying to study about the effectiveness, for example, for the climate policies, because you don't know what factors playing more major roles. Here, I have several thoughts in my mind. So regarding the case you selecting as a Canada and Australia, of course, that also connects to your personal background and history. I was trying to challenge you a bit to think about how you can maybe scale up with this current case study if you try to apply in a different political conditions, and what would be the change for this framework? Would that still remain relevant to apply to different political condition? For example, if it is the case in China, it's more like the top down, and the central government set all the scene, and the local government will just be responsible for implementing the policy. And I will assume that they will change the condition in a way. So maybe think about in that direction if you want to scale up to other countries. And then what would be the change, and what would be the key condition you have in your mind based on the data you collect through those interviews? And also compare two cases alone. You also touch upon during your presentation that you already find some differences among two countries, right? So what would be your thinking or your taking from those differences? For example, within those 6 practices, do you have a preference when you try to rank? Will you like internally try to ranking them? Which one plays the bigger influence on the overall outcome? Is the policy making or the other knowledge-based solution that can have bigger impact on the real outcome? And also thinking about policy process, I can imagine maybe people who are making the policy are different from people who are implementing the policies, and maybe they will face different backlash during this process, right? So that's also relating to the political system or the political stability. What are the stability of those key roles at different policy process? Are they rotate from time to time, or they probably will remain for the same position for really relatively long time? I think the stability will also probably put an impact on the real outcome, right? And also you mentioned like how the party change within the political system, that will also have impact. So maybe draw a diagram of the internal, external. The external is the people who are making the real impact. And internal is the cadre, like the stability, the rotation, and also what are their knowledge base. So are they coming from a background that is with more diverse experience with environmental or climate practice? If they have those knowledge, probably they will have a better situation or position to really tackle this backlash. So that's something I have in my mind. If you put it a diagram like external, internal, right? Because they already have that. Maybe just take a step further to think about the people itself at the center and try to understand what are the conditions. What else? See. Yeah, also regarding the policy recommendation, because I don't really have the full draft that you submit. Maybe you already mentioned that in your paper. What would be your more practical policy recommendation in order to better equip those bureaucrats when they encounter this climate policy backlash? Maybe under different country situation that would be different. But I will also be curious about if you can elaborate a bit more about what's your policy recommendation in your mind that you already think that probably will help, or that probably will, enhance the situation. Yeah, I think I will just stop here. Maybe we can have further discussion later. But again, congratulations. I think that's really wonderful work. Yeah.
Thanks. Do I have a couple of minutes to respond? Oh, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And I think you pick up some really, really important points that some of which I think are covered in the bigger paper that is in the review quagmire at the moment. But that's really helpful at this stage, so I can really sharpen and hone them. I think your question about, yeah, could you generalize these conditions to other cases? That's a really, really key one in my mind right now, because obviously in-depth qualitative case studies, you need to be careful about being robust with these things. But at the same time, I think there's other Western sort of liberal bureaucracies in that sort of professionalized sense where these conditions could equally apply. And that brings me to your idea about policy recommendations. That's what I would really love to do, to go back to my old colleagues and say, hey, look, say in terms of which of those 6 practices you can use when backlash inevitably comes, have a look at, say, the example I had of procedure steering. Both of the sets of bureaucrats in my cases were really strong on using that. They use that to anticipate and react to backlash really strongly. So maybe that's an advantage that other bureaucrats can use as well, and that I could actually recommend in terms of policy making. So yeah, thank you so much, and I'm happy to further discuss.
Maybe in the interest of time, we can skip this the Q&A session this time, but I would suggest that if you have any questions at all, just put them in the Q&A, and maybe Jasmine can also have a look at that and just answer it in the chat. So maybe moving on to our next presentation. It comes from Chris Höhne, who is a senior researcher at the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. He's presenting Addressing Normative Trade-offs in Climate Policy Making, as you can already see. And he will discuss how governments navigate competing norms such as climate mitigation versus energy security or economic growth, and the mechanisms they use to resolve these trade-offs. Chris, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Hello. I hope you can see my slide. I can't see you anymore. And so this is I'm starting a kind of spin-off project on addressing normative trade-offs, and this is kind of a first attempt here. It's not a full-fledged paper. It's more theoretical perspectives paper at the moment. So the starting point is that in the last decades we've seen only incremental climate mitigation efforts being implemented alongside continuous GHG intensive practices. So the result of that is that these days there's only a little carbon budget left if we want to stay within 1.5 degree global warming. So preventing dangerous climate change requires increasingly to take radical and also rapid measures to stay within 1.5 degree. But the thing is, the norm on climate mitigation, so the normative expectation to undertake measures on climate mitigation is in conflict to some extent with alternative norms, or these alternative norms are invoked to provide contestation of climate mitigation. So these could be norms like energy security, employment security, current individual freedoms, or the promotion of economic development. And so basically attempting on more transformational change requires increasingly to address these trade-offs. And so my starting point here is whether, how, and under what conditions are these trade-offs partially resolved by governmental actors. And what are norms here? So norms are collective expectations for appropriate behavior by a community of actors. And coming from the cultural translation scholarship, I argue that a particular norm or a normative expectation, which can be inscribed into international regimes or in domestic law, will always result in, so actors, when they engage with these norms, they would always come up with their own interpretations here, which are based on their specific background conditions. So different actors will have different interpretations of these norms. And when they face a situation, they have to decide, okay, which norms apply in this situation, which might already be different based on different interpretations. And then they have to provide for themselves interpretations. What does this norm mean actually for me in this situation? And then they need to relate these norms to each other. So this is what I mean with norm hierarchies. So these actors need to create norm hierarchies, and then they can do it in a transformational way or in an incremental way. So, for example, a new norm like climate mitigation could be superordinated to previous dominant norms. So, for example, consider economic development, economic growth norms. So if you want to, one example would be a transformational adjustment would be to put climate mitigation as a norm above the economic growth norm. So this would then allow for sufficiency measures or degrowth policies. A rather incremental adjustment would rather be that the new norm, here the climate mitigation norm, is subordinated to previous dominant norms. So climate mitigation is put below economic development and growth, which is currently the case with most green growth policies, which only results in incremental adjustments of the norm hierarchy and also incremental policy changes. And of course, there's always the chance to, or the possibility to reject a norm. So when domestic governmental actors, they now need to deal with different contrasting normative expectations coming from international regimes and domestic laws. And then the question is why and under which conditions do governmental actors choose a more transformative or rather an incremental adjustment of the norm hierarchy? And so being inspired by scientific realist methodology, there are always several mechanisms which come together to produce an outcome, and they are facilitated or hampered by particular conditions. And so in this paper, I first come up with a couple of conditions which might facilitate or hamper a more transformative or a more incremental adjustment of the norm hierarchy. So the first one is cultural path dependence. So pre-existing prescription of domestic norms and their hierarchy in the past, so the hierarchy of the previous norms in the past, might provide a resonance room for new norms. So consider, for example, deep embedded cultural norms on individual freedom to use cars, so car driving, which are superordinated over other uses of transportation, for example, in the German Road Traffic Act. So car driving is superordinated to biking, which then provides already a norm hierarchy, which subordinates climate mitigation and which prevents transmodal changes in the transportation sector in Germany in a transformational way. So here there's some sort of historical cultural path dependence, which kind of reproduces the already existing norm hierarchy. The second one is the perceived material necessities. So a norm is perceived by governmental actors also in terms of the extent to which it corresponds to perceived domestic material necessities, which could be like securing cheap and reliable energy for industrial production. So considering the German gas crisis resulting from the Russian attack on Ukraine, the German government decided to allow the energy company RWE to continue coal extraction in Lützerath for energy security reasons, despite the contestation by Friday for Future activists that demanded an immediate stop of coal extraction based on the climate mitigation norm. And the German government still decided it, allowed it. So there's a clear norm hierarchy which puts energy security first here, even though coal extraction from Nussdorf is not within the carbon budget of Germany for staying within 1.5 degree. The third one is material prospect. So especially when in international climate finance, international climate cooperation, there's a lot of need for and also a lot of calls for increased international climate funding. But for this climate funding to be transformational for the recipient governments, it needs to be sufficiently high and credible. So consider, for example, the just energy transition partnerships with, for example, Indonesia, the international partners group. It kind of offered 20 billion US dollar, but if you have a closer look, it's only 500 million US dollar in grants. So the rest is basically expensive loans or private funding, which is supposed to jump in here. So 500 million isn't really, sufficiently high to allow for a transformational norm adjustment in the energy sector in Indonesia. Governments may aim for international social recognition, which may influence their perceived norm hierarchy. So they might, if they have a desire for international recognition, they might prioritize norms with higher international legitimacy over those that don't have this sort of international backing. So consider, for example, the Modi Indian government, which tries to increase its international image by setting up the International Solar Alliance and promoting solar energy around the world, which then also facilitates solar discourses domestically. Lastly, societal actors may also influence the norm hierarchies of governmental actors. So they may defend the status quo or may actively lobby or demonstrate in favor of a different norm configuration. So, for example, when the Indonesian president, Yudhoyono, tried to use the REPLUS partnership with Indonesia to change the paradigm, the norm hierarchies in the forestry sector towards the forest governance reform process, there were vested interests of non-state actors in combination with public actors who kind of leveraged their opposition against it through the line Ministry of Forestry. Then we have a couple of mechanisms which could help to basically facilitate a transformational adjustment of the norm hierarchy. I don't have time to speak about all of them. I will only talk about two. So the first one, competition. So governmental actors may try to improve the material performance of their jurisdiction compared to competitors. And they may do so when they perceive, so that there's a positive facilitating condition of material necessities. They will do so when they perceive this as an opportunity to reach certain material goals. So, for example, consider the Indian government, which invested in solar energy expansion in order to secure energy access for their growing industrial production and to develop an own manufacturing basis that will be competitive in a green economy. So perceived material necessities then kind of facilitate this competition approach. But at the same time, we also see societal interests hampering this mechanism. So there's still contestation of coal phase out, and there's actually a coal expansion currently going on through vested public and private interests here. The second one I already explained, the combination of, with the example of the just energy transition, that the funding needs to be sufficiently high. So I'll just talk about persuasion here. So persuasion is basically a situation or especially based on arguing between several actors in which a proposer tries to convince governmental actors by providing the better argument in order to convince governmental actors to adjust the norm hierarchy in a not transformative way. So this is usually the mechanism through which transnational city networks like ICLE, or particularly the ICLE office, try to convince municipal governments to transform their norm hierarchy towards decarbonization. And in many cases of larger cities, this is also facilitated by the aim of the mayors to increase their international image. However, then you also have, so this is a facilitating condition, but then you also have kind of hampering conditions such as cultural path dependence. So also in these cases, dominance of one particular understanding of current individual freedoms in the form of car driving, which are inscribed into domestic law, which then still prevents transformational adjustment of the norm hierarchy. Two further mechanisms, which could be interesting, are complex learning. Through learning, you're trying to transformatively adjust your norm hierarchy, or judicial coercion. So we see increasing climate litigation cases, and there the courts also need to basically establish hierarchies of norms in the decisions, which then could also force the government to change their policies. So yeah, it's a kind of a starting point here to think about addressing normative trade-offs, and I propose some theoretical concept here with underlying conditions and potential mechanisms to overcome these normative trade-offs in a transformative way, and it's just a starting point for me. So my next step will be expand this theoretical framework. So if you have mechanisms and conditions in mind you want to propose to me, I'm very much interested in that. And then I want to sort a little bit the existing literature based on my different categories, and then test it in different case studies. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. I think you already have a really rich theoretical framework there, and I'm excited to see where you go with this in terms of maybe empirical application as well. I want to bring Xenia and Ratna back to the floor.
Sure.
And maybe in the interest of time, just jump in with your feedback if you have anything.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you so much for your presentation, for sharing the paper earlier. Of course, it's the preliminary work, fully understandable, but it's already quite rich enough. So it was very interesting to read it. A few real reflections, and we could discuss further in detail. For the sake of time, I will be brief. So the first thing, I wanted to perhaps invite you to consider the format or reconsider the format of this work, because you mentioned you would like to make it a perspective paper, but it feels like, to do justice to all the elements you're raising there, the framework, the conditions, the mechanisms, empirical cases, it could be fully fledged research paper with a lot of substance. So the format might be constraining for you. The second point I wanted to raise regarding the trade-offs, the choice of the term and the phenomenon in particular, because trade-off has very sort of relatively positive connotation. It's sort of a compromising position. So you choose in between, or you try to have the amalgam of things, but eventually there is a balance, a compromise, a trade-off. But the feeling I get through the paper and through your presentation, it's more about the conflicts or tensions between norms. And this is sort of different, because to a reader it might give different impression here. And perhaps actually the norm conflict or the tension, then this is something government could resolve through different approaches, mechanisms, etc. But trade-off itself doesn't seem to be a problem per se. The third point in the paper, and also in passing, you did mention liberal environmentalism, and you do consider it as a meta norm still reigning in the climate change field. And it would be perhaps useful to critically assess this, because it does change. It's work in progress. It's sort of losing this hegemonic power at the moment. So it's no longer the case as it was 20 years ago, when Bernstein work was really sort of taking place and there is perhaps you could add more like critical take on this if you feel like it, based on the evolution of the norms in the field. And the final point from my side, it's very clear what you mean by transformational incremental, but there is something in between which could be sort of called, I don't know, norm appropriation, when actually norms lose their rigid, I don't know, form or the way they're portrayed, but then they get appropriated to the context. It could be like norms adaptation, because norm could travel from international level to national level and slightly in a changed form as appropriate. And that is why perhaps there is something in between to unpack and to learn about this. So this is it from me in a nutshell. And Radna, if you would like to add something, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. It was really amazing. When I read about it, the literature has been rich in that. But just the 2 points I want to make, not much, regarding the first, like when it comes to the transformative and incremental, when you're doing the, I'm unable to understand, like when you're promoting for the transformative norm, like then why that was more focused over there, like rather than incremental, why it would be the core important point there. That was one. And other thing is that when you have spoken about like different conditions promoting, like one factor to be maybe like you could consider is the bureaucratic influence also here. Usually, I mean, it can be seen that bureaucratic influence is all bureaucrats also, like it is majorly driven by the political agendas and all. But like I do think personally that bureaucrats has their own say, like they could be much different from what society wants or the political backing wants. So that could be one element, maybe you could look into that. So these are like I would like to highlight.
Shall I answer directly, Emilia? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. If you want to.
I wasn't sure if you wanna collect questions from the queue from the community or so. Okay. So thanks for reading the paper and for commenting it. Yeah, it's just in a very early stage, and yeah, that's why I meant a theoretical perspective kind of paper. It's not meant to be published in that way. Very good point with the trade-offs versus the conflicts. I need to think about this. And you're right. I mean, it's a very interesting point that you say trade-offs is more positively connoted. There is. I'm more interested in conflicts, and I'm just about to start to also read the whole contestation literature here, and to kind of enrich my argument and my conceptual framework here. So, and I'm not so sure about your comment with the liberal environmentalism, because when we analyzed NDCs, the second NDCs, so from just a couple of years ago, there's such, I mean, when they talk about economic aspects, it's all about green growth. So, I mean, Venezuela and Bolivia are the only ones talking about anti-capitalism, and they do so for other reasons. So there's not a degrowth kind of sufficiency, not even sufficiency measures are mentioned there. So in my view, it's very much liberal environmentalism. And my conceptual perspective on is norm translation. So basically these different interpretations, translations of norms. And yeah, norm appropriation or norm localization is, yeah, it's basically kind of putting it within an existing context. And it's a good point to think about that, because in my perspective, this is always only incremental, because you have a dominant local norm, and then there's another norm coming in, and then you just subsume it, because Acharya mentioned that you basically do it to promote the legitimacy of your already existing norm. So that's the whole idea behind localization. But it's a good point to bring this in conversation here. So thanks. Yeah. So why do I think transformative is important here? I think what I see, if there are perceived conflicts, tensions, trade-offs whatsoever between climate mitigation as a norm and alternative norms, usually it's resolved in a way which, puts the focus or the normative focus on the alternative norm. And in a way, we don't get these rapid and radical policies and mitigation measures, which we actually need right now. I mean, there was a study basically saying for Germany, we have like 5 more years and then our carbon budget is over. I mean, yeah, and still we're kind of not forbidding car driving, this kind of way. I mean, this would be also very radical, but in a way, we only opt for very incremental changes. And then what we see, for example, in Germany, the GHG emissions hardly change over time in the transportation sector, for example. Good point with bureaucratic influence. I thought about that. I had it in other work. I looked at it. So I'll think about it, and I think it depends on the case study. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks all. Yes, I think we just move on to Sharon now so that she also has hopefully as much time as possible for her last presentation. She's a PhD researcher at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and she focuses on China's evolving climate leadership within the UNFCCC in the post-Paris era, and she will discuss how China navigates both domestic and international challenges to its climate leadership. I'm really excited for your presentation, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm Sharon Lee. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Vrije University Amsterdam at the Institute for Environmental Study. And this work is the work that I co-author with my supervisor, Philip Pepberg and Oscar Wiederberg. And we try to understand how China's evolving climate leadership looks like in the post-Paris era, so more updated picture. And yes, so actually the motivation is super straightforward. So China is the largest carbon emitter in the world, and how China play a very important role in achieving or the success of Paris Agreement. So, but the scholarly like the literature that is trying to understand China's role in the global climate governance have been very divided along the course of time. So there's a more optimistic perspective is that try to understand China as a more like increasingly more proactive players in the game, and try to take more leadership in this process, especially in the South-South collaboration. But another side of the view is like more skeptical about China still put the domestic priority very higher than the other priorities, and if the economics development have this needs, China will probably go back to the norms and have more fossil fuel production. So there's a lot of different views, and that is among the current literature. So that's the motivation that we try to understand, and how to have a more updated picture of how China situated itself in the global climate governance. Do we see any leadership that yield out of it, and what are the channels that China plays and to exercise its climate leadership in a way, and how we can have a more practical frameworks that we can use to systematically evaluate a country's profile in terms of climate leadership. So that's the research question we have, is how can we identify climate leadership when we see one in practice? And if we divide it into more sub-question, is like how we can qualitatively operationalize when we do the assessment, and what are the different leadership types we observe, and what are the channels, and what are the how does that look like in the practice, and how can we do the comparison in terms of if compare China with other countries. Like I said, this is still very, very initial stage of work. So this is more like an exercise of mapping, and yeah, your feedback will be very helpful. So so I start with try to understand what are the types of leadership that can be useful to when we try to understand climate leadership, and also what are the current knowledge and findings when we try to understand China's role in it. So we have this 5 different types of leadership. Actually is way more, and I try to categorize them based on the definition, and associate with different findings along each one of them. I will not really went through all of them, so maybe just highlight one or two. So for example, about the exemplary or directional leadership is that it means that you're leading others by taking the examples. So how we can measure the current understanding of China is that China really promote itself in this type of leadership within the collaboration with the South country, have this South-South initiatives, and also because China have a very productive domestic energy, renewable energy policies, and also the overseas energy, that will setting the example for other countries. And another maybe I can highlight is instrumental leadership, that is mostly within the negotiation, climate negotiation, how China be the broker, and also building alliance with other mostly South country to have and also sometimes take necessary compromise in order to have a more collective goals. So that's the findings under each one of these categories about the knowledge of China, how China exercise those climate leadership. And based on that, I have a more like mapping exercise about different types of leadership, because sometimes it can be super confusing about differentiate those type of leadership and how that's situated. Sometimes they can overlap. So I will walk through a bit about this picture. So here you can see the instrumental leadership is about how a country behave within more like in the situation of within a climate negotiation. So you will view the actors who have this instrument leadership like an orchestra conductor. So they will be the mediator when the negotiation goes on and try to take the leader roles and to make these things happen. Sometimes they need to make some necessary concession or compromises and to be the broker. And the other is like through the diagram is like inside the negotiation, outside the negotiation, and domestic action and international engagement. So those different types of leadership were well situated at different locations, but of course sometimes they will have this overlapping. And through this diagram, you can also see the ideational leadership is more like a storyteller around the campfire. So mainly influencing others by telling this, introducing new concepts, new narratives, and try to influence this negotiation, but also like the broader term of climate governance. And then we see the exemplary direction, the exemplary or directional leadership, and that can be viewed as a more like a trailblazer hiker. So which means that you lead others by setting the example, taking the lead. So it's more like if you can do, you show the others that others can also do. So in the case of China, if China succeed its climate commitment and peak earlier than it committed, and that can show the others that the motivation and also showing the examples. And here is sorry, I couldn't find my mouse. Yeah, here is the cognitive or conceptual leadership you can view as a lighthouse keeper. So basically you influence others through knowledge-based generating or capacity building initiative with others. So this impact is transit through the knowledge channel. And last but not least, the structural leadership, you can view it as a role builder. So basically, this type of climate leadership will be magnificent through the material powers that the actor have. For example, the political power or economic powers. In the case of China, it's more like China uses economic power through trading, and you can have this build this role or channels to other global South country and have this, like for example the South climate finance aid. So you have these channels to exercise the power. So that's the evidence you can observe in the practice. So in the end, we would like to have this operationalized table that we can measure different types of leadership that in practice. Sorry about this like very heavy text here. So basically, we have two levels of indicators that help you to understand how you can evaluate one type of leadership in a more qualitative way, because I know there is a lot of modeling way of doing this by calculating, for example, the patterns you have or calculating the policy numbers. But we would like to do a more in-depth knowledge to really understand what does it mean when we see one. So I will just use maybe two examples here. For example, the cognitive or conceptual leadership here. Basically, the second level of indicator is that how this country can contribute to the global knowledge generation about the climate governance, and also how the educational capacity building initiatives are building through this by these actors taking the lead. And a third level of indicator will can be the theories or conceptual framework that is being introduced by these actors, and how many research center or think tank are initiated by this country. So that's just one example of this framework. Another probably can also be interesting is the structural leadership that is about the material power that a country can have and to have impact on others. You can also tell it through the infrastructure project abroad. I think in the case of China, it's more like the South-South collaboration, also the BRI, the Belt Road initiatives. So through those specific channel, you can have this overseas impact on other countries and have a positive or negative impact on climate governance. And those can be calculated through trade agreement or initial funding for major infrastructure project overseas. So that's some ways that you can do the measurements. I think hopefully in the end, this table will have this full package of also providing the data source that you can turn to. So some data you can collect it through the open source. For example, like the submission to the UNFCCC portal. Others, you can probably only gather through interviews with the stakeholders and also observation, for example, in the negotiation. So that's the way that I can picture the result of this paper or finding of this paper is I have this table of operationalization of these measurements. And thank you. I think that's the end. And like I said, it's a very preliminary work, and I would very much, I think it would be very much helpful for, because Jasmine is my discussant. I think you have a lot of experience with the interviews. I think a lot of the data will be collecting through interviews. So maybe you can have some hints for me that how I can proceed with the current framework, or you think there's some changes might needed the other way around. So it's more deductive or inductive. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. In the interest of time, Jasmine, do you want to just jump in, maybe also especially with Sharon, just ask you for specific feedback? I'd be really interested to hear how your very different approaches can maybe still somehow speak to each other, maybe in terms of data collection or whatever's on your mind.
Look, Sharon, I think I found your paper so far super interesting, and I think its real strength is in its practicality, right? So coming from a government system myself, originally, I can really see, and I'm really convinced by what you've got so far about the need to look more systematically at China's climate leadership. I think you've got a really clear gap that you've articulated there, so really well done in that. I think in terms of your data collection and methodology, as you asked, I have some more detailed comments I can send you, but I think one of the main questions I had was, how are you going to approach this? And the table that you just outlined is a really great start in that. I think really it shows that you're trying to systematically operationalize each of these conditions. I wish I could have done that as systematically in my own research, to be honest. Like, it's really great that you've managed to pull those together. I think from experience, one of the questions I had on that was then, okay, how do you set out criteria that enable you to get that breadth of data that you need against these indicators, but not be totally overwhelmed at the same time? So even like the document list that you propose in terms of documents, I would say even just the first one, which is on international climate policy documents, well, that could be a huge pile of documents, right? Thousands and thousands. So I'd encourage you to think really pragmatically, kind of along the lines of the intent of it, to be practical, think practically about how you narrow and then justify your document selection. Because no one will expect you to look at every single one of those things. That's impossible, right? What it really needs to justify is that you've looked at those key ones, kind of like Seni was saying, the key strategic documents, some sort of justification like that. The other main comment I have, I'll just stick one more, is about the overall goal of the paper. So you make a really convincing argument about the need to look at China's climate leadership, but you also hint, maybe more in the paper than the presentation, that you'd really like this framework to be a little bit more generalizable, like you could apply it to other countries. And sometimes your ideas about that are a little bit conflicting, particularly as those 5 leadership styles, as you outlined with the really excellent stories about them, they, from what I can tell, are drawn mostly from case studies, existing case studies of Chinese climate leadership. So I think the next step there, if you want to take that really ambitious and bold move of saying we could generalize this, and I think you definitely can, is that you'd need to bring in a little bit more literature from empirics outside of China. So I don't know if there's any other non-Western countries, because you say otherwise it's a bit too Western centric, or even just focusing on other major emitters. I don't know, but yeah, looking at sort of comparative cases of big countries that are either seen to be sort of the climate leaders or maybe the opposite, climate laggards. What do they do, and how can you benchmark the assessment you're making of China against those countries in the literature? Yeah, and that's my 2 cents, but I'm very happy to talk more.
Thank you.
Yeah, if there isn't anything else that you would like to now discuss publicly, of course, you can always continue discussing per email or whatever. I also don't currently see any questions in the Q&A. If you want to pose more general questions now that the presentations are over, feel free, but I think we're also already running over time. I just want to say thank you to everyone who presented. I think we've seen lots of really fruitful points for further discussion, and how these really different perspectives can sort of complement each other and speak to each other, especially on, just an example, the scope of the comparative lens that we take and how we maybe can apply our findings to other national contexts and the challenges that also has. So I hope that we can, in some form, continue this discussion. Blake has already put the link to a working group to the Earth System Governance website in the chat. Here you can also find info on how to join if anyone's listening who's not already part of the working group. We'd really love to have you there. We're welcome for all. Yes, and thank you for being here. That's it for me.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Congrats.
Let's keep
Thank
in
you.
touch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.